5-7. We're on our way. All right, boys, keep tight now.
Luke, I have no approach vector. I'm not set.
Steady, Dak. Attack pattern Delta.
Go now.
All right, coming in. Bobby, you still with me? That armor's too strong for blasters. Rogue group, use your harpoons and tow cables. Go for the legs. It might be our only chance of stopping them. That. Rogue 3!
Copy, Rogue Leader.
Wedge, I've lost my gunner. You'll have to take this shot. I'll cover for you.
Set your harpoon. Follow me on the next pass.
Coming around, Rogue Leader.
Steady, Rogue 2.
Activate harpoon. Good shot, Jansen. One more pass. Coming around. Watch me. Cable out. Let her go. Detach cable. Cable detached.
He instantly ejaculated.
Oh, this is suicide.
There, that looks pretty good.
That looks pretty good.
Yeah, it'll do nicely.
Excuse me, man, but where are we going?
Sweetheart, we're taking off.
No!
I see it.
We're doomed!
The cave is collapsing.
This is no cave.
What?
If you weren't born in a time when the internet wasn't a thing, and wasn't going to be a thing for quite a while still, a time in which even cable TV or DVDs weren't a thing, you will never understand the sheer awesomeness of these scenes. I was a kid watching national television in the mid-80s. Yes, things were a lot slower back then. I had just finished watching the first Star Wars film for the nth time in preparation for The Empire Strikes Back, which was going to play for the first time on national television. The family was gathered around the TV, and my uncle was ready to record the movie on a Betamax tape, a tape that I would watch endlessly in the days, weeks, and months to come. Well, many, many years later, I can still confidently say that this has been by far the most impressive film that I've ever watched. It was a tour de force of incredible scene after incredible scene. It was a maelstrom of awesome, never-before-seen ideas executed to perfection in a time in which nothing came even remotely close to this. So, fast forward past The Return of the Jedi, which was an awesome film with a few bad moments and a few bad ideas, and all the way to the first movie of the prequel trilogy. Well, I know many of you guys are not going to love me for saying this, but to me, they fucked up quite a few things with a prequel trilogy.
I need a midichlorian count.
What the fuck is this?
I don't know.
Midichlorians, phony-looking CGI spaceships, an introduction that established a trade federation as the new bad guys. Oh no, not a trade federation. Whatever are we going to do about it? Guys, I know an evil empire sets a pretty high bar, but a trade federation? Also, this guy was shit. And then came the Attack of the Clones, which featured a cheesy love story and one of the worst actings that I had ever seen.
I killed them. I killed them all. They're dead. Every single one of them. And not just the men, but the women. And the children, too.
Yep, this guy was bad. And it's okay if you like the prequel. I'm not trying to get you not to like it. In fact, there is plenty to like about these films. There were some pretty badass lightsaber fights. There were a few exciting action set pieces here and there, if a little bit too CGI intensive. A lot of carefully planned fan service here and there, etc. I'm just telling you why I didn't like these films. And it all comes down to one argument, really. It was not my Star Wars.
End of discussion.
But then this absolute jewel of a video game came out in the year 2003. And I don't think I can describe in words what this game meant to me. I don't think I can ever do it justice. See, that boy who was blown away with The Empire Strikes Back in the early 80s, grew to become a huge video game nerd.
Video games are my life.
Yep, this was me in the 80s and 90s. And by the time Knights of the Old Republic came out, I was already pretty sure about the type of gamer that I was. I already had a pretty clearly defined list of things that I wanted to see in my games. Thanks to Fallout, Baldur's Gate 2, Arcanum, and Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, amongst others. I really knew that as a gamer, emergent gameplay and player agency, and a character creation and progression system that supported these things, as well as a solid story grounded in verisimilitude, were at the top of the list of things that I wanted to see in my games. So now imagine that you give this Star Wars fanboy, turned young adult in the mid-2000s, a game that allows him to relive the Star Wars experience but as the main character of the story. Put him at the forefront of an adventure that has everything, from narrow escapes, to daring rescues, to space battles, to desperate fights for survival against overwhelming Sith forces, and make it look and feel like his Star Wars. And more importantly, give him agency over the story and offer various alternative paths for him to overcome all of the game's challenges. Of course he's going to say that this is the best game that he's ever played. Or maybe not, but it's surely going to be in the neighborhood. Knights of the Old Republic is everything I ever wanted in a Star Wars game, and I am here to tell you all about it. Welcome to Ye Olde Entertainment. My name is Alex, and as you know, it is my duty, my mission, my purpose in life to help you decide whether that game that you have been plucking daisies about for so long is indeed the right game for you or not. Not this time though, because
I am a fan.
and that is the review that you're going to get, a fan's review. As you know, I review games using a system of categories that I think are relevant to the genre of the game at hand. And the game at hand this time is Knights of the Old Republic, an RPG with real-time with pause combat mechanics that is part of the Star Wars universe. And when it comes to those, character creation and character progression are up first. I've made it clear time and time again that I've never been a fan of D&D's brand of character progression, and Knights of the Old Republic features a system that resembles D&D 3.5 edition. This is my favorite D&D edition, as far as video games go that is, but I'll admit that it still isn't my favorite character progression system. But like we always say here on the channel, a character creation and progression system is only as good as the freedom it gives players to experience the game in their own terms. And if we measure Knights of the Old Republic with that tape, the game's character progression system is beautiful. And let's see why. We have a Star Wars themed game that is an RPG that features a character progression system that offers both emergent gameplay and player agency. So I'd be a fool to complain about it. It would be like having sex with Priscilla Ricard but complaining about the fact that she only likes to do it Amazon style. Pro tip: you don't complain when that happens, you shut the fuck up and let the woman take you. Knights of the Old Republic features 3 different classes for you to choose from: Soldier, Scout, and Scoundrel, and each comes with a very brief explanation about the playstyle that they are best suited for. After you choose your class, you get a pool of points to spend on the different attributes of your character. These attributes should be very familiar to those who have played D&D before, but you still get a nice little explanation about what each of them is good for. I personally like that you don't have any dice roll simulation mechanics here. You just go ahead and spend your attribute points however you wish. If you are unsure about what the best distribution for your class is, you can go ahead and click on the recommended button and then do a few tweaks if you wish. But if you really want to ace the game, and you know exactly the type of character that you want to roll, you're better off doing your own stuff, of course. If you think of it, Jedis are like space paladins, you know, they are unequivocally lawful and good and have a code and shit.
Paragons of light and justice, sweeping away all iniquity before them.
And I personally like that, just like charisma is usually the paladin's most important attribute in D&D, its description in Knights of the Old Republic states that a high charisma adds modifiers to Force-related feats and powers that are very important to all Jedi classes. And that brought a smile to my face. I felt it was very consistent. And
massive spoilers coming your way.
Later on in the game, you unlock a second form of progression that works like a specialty. Basically, you get to choose between 3 different types of Jedi. You have the Consulars, which are good with Force skills but not particularly outstanding with lightsaber combat, the Guardians, which are the opposite, ace swordsmen but not great with Force skills, and the Sentinels, which sit somewhere in between. And I love that Master Dorak asks you a few questions about how you would solve different situations, and depending on your answers, he recommends the Jedi specialty that he believes is more consistent with your approach to problem solving. And as far as role-playing goes, I think this is absolutely brilliant. You can't choose a different specialty, of course, if you have a particular playstyle in mind. I also love that both forms of progression are super organic to the game's theme and lore, but more importantly, that they effectively translate into significantly different ways to play the game in every respect. Which takes us to the one thing that I care the most about when it comes to a game's character progression system, which is whether or not it provides me the means to go on about every aspect of the gameplay my way. I usually play RPGs for a second time to see how things would have turned out if I had taken different decisions story-wise. And whenever I do, I go for a different race, class, or gender just to add a touch of variety. And I appreciate when playing a different class, race, or gender translates into a different experience. I also appreciate when, during a first playthrough, I come across things that I can't do, approaches that I can't take, or places that I can't access because I'm not the right class, race, or gender. If there are enough of these things, I can even play the game again just out of completionist's curiosity. But to me, these things are second in importance to the story. If I know the story is going to play out in the exact same way because it's boringly linear, or if I'm not interested in other potential outcomes, then I tend not to play the game a second time just to try out a new class, race, or gender. The game, and more specifically the game's character progression system, has to make a very compelling case for me to be interested in playing the game again with a different build. It should make the case that I am missing out on some serious fun and replay value. And I can't think of many ARPGs that do this for me, but when it comes to CRPGs, I admit that very few games that use D&D or D&D-like systems make a compelling enough case for me to play the game again just to try a new class, archetype, or party composition. Well, Knights of the Old Republic joins Icewind Dale 2 and the Temple of Elemental Evil as one of the brightest exceptions to this rule for me. I wanted to play Knights of the Old Republic again to take different decisions story-wise, because there are not only 2 different paths that you can follow, but also very major story bits that can be navigated in very different ways. And there's also a lot of, let's call it, non-critical story content to discover for those who are curious enough to take the road less traveled in successive playthroughs. but Knights of the Old Republic is designed in a way that made me want to play it again because my choice of class, skills, feat, and Jedi classes felt unique and gratifying, but they also left me craving for more. Knights of the Old Republic's gameplay mix features combat, a lot of combat actually, exploration, puzzle solving, questing, and several other thingies, and the way in which you build your character affects all of these things. If you don't have a good enough skill of security, there are going to be areas that you're not going to be able to access. If your persuasion skill is not good enough, you'll be forced to resort to violence or bribery in several passages that you could have otherwise solved peacefully or more cheaply. If you have a good enough repair skills and enough repair materials, you're going to be able to tip the odds in your favor in various combat encounters by fixing, hacking, and resetting droids to make them fight on your side. And if you have enough computer skills, you are going to be able to sabotage several areas to wipe out entire groups of enemies, thus sparing you the trouble of actually having to fight them. If you're good with demolition, you'll have plenty of mines to use against some of the more powerful enemies in the game. And this all amounts to one thing. The game rewards you for choosing to be good at something, and it does so in a way that is super gratifying. It blows most other games out of the water in this respect. I don't like that there are many challenges that you can circumvent in this game in various ways. If you are not good enough with persuasion, for example, you can always go out and do some other shit, level up a couple of times, improve your persuasion skills, and then go back to the NPC that's giving you some trouble and have the conversation again. Also, almost every security challenge can be hand-waved by simply beating the ever-living shit out of whatever it is you're trying to open. Yup, I sure showed that locker who's boss. And the reason why I don't like this is because it makes some of the decisions you make every time you level matter a little bit less. I also would have liked if my particular choice of Jedi specialty had been acknowledged in a few more situations and by a few more people. As it is, your Jedi specialty only gets a mention when you acquire it. Maybe you could have had Bastila, Jolie, or Yuhani remark upon it, or better yet, you could have had Darth Malak himself say something about it. But those are just very minor nitpicks in an otherwise deeply rewarding character progression system. Gameplay. Knights of the Old Republic's gameplay mix consists of combat, exploration, questing, puzzle solving, card games, swoop racing, first-person shooting in space, locker bashing, and yo mama. And most of it is pretty good. Not perfect, because the game hasn't aged all that gracefully in some respects, but pretty good. It's still in the Olympus of games in my book. And let's start with combat, since it's probably the most prevalent aspect of the gameplay. There is a lot of combat in Knights of the Old Republic, at least when compared to other post-Baldur's Gate 2 Bioware titles. And it's fun, challenging, and it feels very Star Warsy. Enemies are varied and have a diverse array of offensive and defensive skills that may even give you pause from time to time and make you scratch your head. My favorite thing about combat in Knights of the Old Republic, though, is that you can overcome these fights by having an OP build, which is the preferred approach that many D&D players have, or you can resort to tactical thinking. During my first playthrough, I was really good with demolition if I recall correctly, so I could easily disarm mines and store them for later use. And I discovered that your mines didn't affect you, so you could plant bombs and then kite enemies into them. And it quickly became my go-to tactic for harder fights.
Also known as cheese.
Trying to use this tactic was a little bit frustrating in some locations because of the game's clunky user experience, but we'll get to that later. But I still resorted to this tactic in my latest playthrough for this video to kill the final boss. But during this last playthrough, since I knew what I was going to be up against at every turn, I chose just the right party members for every location and situation. And I also leveled up certain skills that I knew were going to come in very handy before they were needed. Oh, so this droid-infested location is coming up next. Better give Bastila some of that sweet anti-droid Jedi magic. Whenever I knew I was going to be up against monsters or enemies that favored melee attacks, I would always bring Karth to pepper them up nicely with range damage. Many times I even scored the kill before the bad guys even reached the party. Kiting, choke points, flanking, all these tactics are useful at one point or another in Knights of the Old Republic, and they can be a pretty solid alternative to the OP build with which you can simply tank and spank away at every enemy. Crowd control is especially important later on in the game, and I like that the ability to crowd control consistently starts to become a thing when you've mastered every other form of combat in the game, and when enemies become too numerous for it to be even viable to succeed without it. So, strategically speaking, you, as a player, can use wisdom or intelligence to beat every combat encounter. Understanding the first as an extensive first-hand knowledge of how to make the most out of your build given the enemies you have to face in the game, and when and where you have to face them, and the second as the capacity to analyze the variables and use the tools at your disposal at the given moment to overcome the challenge. This game also has some pretty amazing itemization. And there's an upgrading mechanic that allows you to take it even further. Weapons have different strengths and weaknesses that are tactically relevant. For example, if you have high dexterity, that means that you're probably going to land many of your hits, so you can go for a skill that gives you extra attacks and pair that up with a lightsaber enhancement that has a chance to stun your enemies. Beyond the initial swords and blasters that you get in the game, rare are the cases of weapons that are flat out better than other weapons. It all depends on your character's proficiencies and the enemies that you're fighting. Knights of the Old Republic, along with Baldur's Gate 2, is the only BioWare game that had me swapping weapons constantly to always have the best equipment for the situation at hand. And that should tell you all about how tactical items are in this game. Because trust me, you want to switch over to ion blasters and rifles when you run into droids and turrets, and then back again to your regular weapons if you're going to fight Sith, soldiers, or monsters. It also has to be said that combat is super clunky, to the point that I can see many new players finding it a little bit too hard to get into, especially if they are used to the more evolved user experience that some modern games that use real-time with pause combat have. But we'll get into that later. One absolutely awesome thing about Knights of the Old Republic is that if you are not the best fighter, but you have good computer talent and you have wisely procured enough resources to do some proper hacking, you can sabotage and overpower the enemy sources in almost every room where there are tough groups of enemies to kill them all at once without breaking a sweat. And if you are good with demolition, you can plant mines and lure enemies into them to do massive amounts of damage. You can even sneak around mobs. And that right there is what I want from my RPGs. Realistic alternatives to pew pew bang bang combat that makes the decisions you make at the character creation and leveling screen matter. And there is a lot of this in Knights of the Old Republic, and I love it. If you have been following the channel, you know that I often refer to Pillars of Eternity 2's Slayer Seeker Survivor DLC when I talk about the different types of challenges in an RPG. In my book, in the combat department, a good RPG has a balanced mix of Slayer, Seeker, and Survivor types of challenges. The ones in which you have to kill before you are killed, the ones in which you have to figure out the one little thing that the enemy does that's making your life miserable, and the ones that are battles of attrition. And Knights of the Old Republic has a little bit of everything. Darth Bando, for example, can be a pain in the ass if you don't figure out how to deal with his life-stealing AoE. He's a good example of a typical Seeker type of challenge. Then you have the waves upon waves of Sith that you have to face near the end of the game. This, in my opinion, is the textbook definition of the Survivor type of challenge. And almost every other fight in the game is of the Slayer type. But those are different types of combat encounters. I'm still going to find them pointless or gratuitous if I don't feel like there's a story reason for me to fight. I like my combat encounters to be framed as story events. I like to feel like there's a lot riding on my success. And that's why I love a good hold the line moment or a let's take the fight to the bad guy situation. And I am happy to report that Knights of the Old Republic absolutely kills it in this respect. There's one-on-one arena duels that you can participate in for money, or to get to the end of a particularly difficult bounty quest that seamlessly serves to tell you more about the local customs and the role that the different races usually play in the world. There are several desperate fights for survival, there are exciting breaking and entering missions, thrilling rescue missions, top-tier mercenaries, and Sith Lords that are trying to hunt you down. You name it, the game's got it. Knights of the Old Republic also features exploration, and although it is mostly on rails, there are a few rooms, corridors, and areas that you can only access if you have the right skill to do so. And that all by itself makes it interesting. Every location has its maps, and some points of interest and exits are marked on it. Word to the wise, never buy any of the maps. It's much more efficient to keep track of where you've been and where you need to go next if you clear the current area map as you go. I personally like very much that you don't have hand-holdy quest markers. I think this is something that has made gaming worse rather than better. I think it takes away from the feeling of adventure and accomplishment, which is something that we're slowly losing these days in games. And speaking of things that we have lost, Knights of the Old Republic features a few vast open areas with points of interest like dead NPCs, bags of loot, and even mission locations. And aside from the planet scouting that you got later in the first Mass Effect, this is something that I haven't seen in BioWare games since Knights of the Old Republic. You also have tomb raiding adventures in places riddled with traps and deadly puzzles, and even a non-mandatory space station location with lots of goodie stuff available for trade. None of these things are spectacular, but they are sure nice to have. Knights of the Old Republic won't win any awards in the exploration department, but it's also not trying to be Outward, Helix, or Everspace 2. This game isn't about exploration, but the exploration you get to do is rewarding enough, and it serves to elevate the quality of other aspects of the gameplay mix, such as combat and character progression. Questing is a big thing in Knights of the Old Republic, and it's all over the fucking place. And I've said this before about other titles, but trust me, they ain't got shit on Knights of the Old Republic. In this game, you have some of the most original, rewarding, and exciting quests that there have ever been in the realm of RPGs, and some of the very worst. For example, there's this Twi'lek dude in Dantooine who asks you to go looking for some girl. Later on in the game, you catch a little stowaway in your ship, a little girl who doesn't speak any language you know. You can easily put 2 and 2 together and figure that she's the girl that the Twi'lek guy is looking for. But in order to make sure she is, you need to learn her language first. She speaks some version of Old Mandalorian, and only a few words are vaguely familiar to you. So there's an interesting matching mini-game of sorts that you have to play with her to narrow down the meaning of some words to pull the thread until you know her name and the reason why she boarded your ship. I think this is a pretty original quest. It's nothing fancy, but I also hadn't seen anything quite like this before. There's another quest in which this woman asks you to find a droid that she believes has been stolen. She refers to him as her companion, and initially you think she's talking about a sentient organic being. You only find that she's talking about a droid later on in the conversation. You can immediately tell that something isn't quite right, but the game is a little bit vague about it, which is very atypical in Knights of the Old Republic because usually this game is as subtle about every idea it seeks to get across as your average gay activist during Pride Month. But when you finally find the droid, it explains that it was built by the woman's husband, who had passed away recently, and this droid was the only thing that the woman had to remember her husband by. But she had grown obsessed with the thing, trying to make it act and talk more and more like her husband. So the droid escaped the farm because it decided that it was unhealthy for the woman to use the droid as a surrogate husband of sorts. So the droid then asks you to destroy it. And at this point you can either destroy the droid or bring it back to the woman. And if you destroy the droid and deliver the news to the woman, she's mad and sad at first, but that's what ultimately helps her turn the page and move on. But then you have some quests that are crazy bad, like this one in which you partner up with this Twi'lek dancer to hit some moves to get the club owner to hire her. Everything about this quest is bad. The hiring policies make no sense, your role in the whole thing makes no sense, what you have to do to get her the job makes no sense, and it really speaks very badly of the editing in the game. Dear developers everywhere, not every idea is worth making it through to the final version of the game. Also, some quests and quest items follow the Fallout New Vegas approach, which means that items and NPCs will be at their intended location irrespective of whether or not you have started the quest that involves them, which is good. That's one of the reasons I loved Fallout New Vegas. The things that you have to do at the Sith Academy are a good example of this. You can kill this thing, for example, before you meet the people who need the thing killed. And if you do, you get the sweet dialogue line, "I already killed the thing you needed dead," and I love this. But there are some other quest items that can only be found if you have the quest that needs them, which is not good. For example, you can only find Bastila's father's holocron if you have the quest, which means that you are going to have to come to this place again and walk to a place that you've already been because you didn't have the quest before. You also have this murder mystery in which there are 2 suspects and a droid that has some information about the whole deal, but you can only ask some pretty obvious questions to both of the suspects and the droid if you have asked some very specific questions before and in a very specific order, and this sucks ass. Also, while the game offers many alternative paths to achieve many of its goals, I wish it had leaned a little bit more into emergent gameplay. For example, in this passage of the game, Yuthura, your Sith mentor in Korriban, will ask you to betray Uthar, the top master at the academy. At this point, you can take various different approaches by choosing different dialogue options. You can betray Yuthura, you can betray Uthar, or you can play them against each other. The decisions you make will lead to different possible outcomes. Yuthura may end up siding with you against Uthar, you may end up having to duel Yuthura, or both Yuthura and Uthar may end up dying before the fight even starts. There may even be more outcomes that I don't know about, but the point is that at the location in which this event takes place, you are asked to undergo a series of tests. In this part, the game holds your hand and tells you that you can use a cryo grenade to freeze this pool of acid, so that you can then walk over it to complete your task. But later on, you confront these guys while they are standing on top of the frozen pool of acid. Are you thinking what I'm thinking? Well, I got news for you. You can't throw a plasma grenade or plant a plasma mine and have it explode to melt the ice and have both of them go down Joker style. Which is something that you would have surely been able to do if this situation had presented itself in Fallout, for example. You also have a couple of quests in which all outcomes are unsatisfactory, like that Romeo and Juliet ripoff quest, which is not only frustrating, but also feels completely out of place. But Knights of the Old Republic compensates for this tenfold with some of the most exciting quests that you've ever had in RPGs. You have a straightforward, you have to get all the MacGuffins type of design, and this time these MacGuffins are pieces of a map to a place called the Starforge, but each piece of the map requires you to go to a planet and solve a planet-specific overarching conundrum, and this is where the game truly shines in the quest department. This planet-specific mission might feel like a bit of a chore at first, but once you talk to all the stakeholders and start pulling the thread of the mission, the stakes go through the roof and you end up taking a legitimate interest in what is going on in the planet. If you dive deep enough and do the extra non-critical effort, so to speak, you can even uncover some jaw-dropping things about the Builders, a species that is no longer around, but that, given the evidence, you can tell that almost 20,000 years ago it was significantly more advanced than any current species in the galaxy. In other words, the building blocks for a concept that later became the turnstone of the Mass Effect trilogy. When I went to Tatooine, for example, it seemed like the key to getting the planet-specific MacGuffin and advancing the main quest revolved around dealing with the local Tusken population. So I was given the task to go full Anakin Skywalker on the Dusty Bastards, but the people who wanted the deed done were the intergalactic evil corporation known as Zerka. So of course there had to be a more Jedi-like approach to the whole situation. There were also a bunch of other secondary quests that pointed in the direction of the Tusken base. So at this point I could have simply braved the desert all the way to the Tusken base and kill every dusty bastard that got in the way, women and children too, and get the main and secondary quests done all in one fell swoop. But see if you take the time to buy a translator droid, find some Tusken clothes to wear as a disguise, deal with a nasty bug that has been present in every fucking version of the game that makes the Tuskens in the base turn on you the second you walk in, you are given the chance to talk to the Tusken leader, and he demands that you do a series of other things to prove your goodwill. And after you do these other things, you can complete the secondary quests. And if you manifest an interest in the Sans people history and culture, the leader will demand that you prove yourself as a warrior to earn the right to listen to the Sans people history from the local storyteller himself. This isn't even a quest, but it basically entails that you kill a ginormous dragon that no one has ever bested before. Killing this dragon is something that you have to do regardless of whether or not the Tusken leader asks you to, because it's the one big thing that you need to do in Tatooine to get the main quest MacGuffin. After killing the dragon and retrieving the MacGuffin, there is little incentive to stay in Tatooine, except maybe go back to the Tusken leader and tell him that you've defeated the dragon and earned the right to hear the story of his people. And I can see a lot of players saying, nah, fuck it, I ain't gonna walk all the way back to the Tusken base and to the leader's room just to tell some dude that I killed the dragon for a non-quest that's not gonna get me any items, credits, or experience. But those who do take the time are treated to a rather obscure but super interesting piece of Star Wars lore. This exchange takes place in the form of a conversation that has your hilarious HK-47 mediating as a translator between you and the storyteller. And unbeknownst to him, the Tusken Lorekeeper provides you with an interesting piece of the puzzle of the Builders, A layer of lore that is completely unnecessary for you to finish the game, but fascinating all the same, because it adds to that uncomfortable feeling that there is something much greater and much more mysterious and obscure than anything that you're currently dealing with. And it's within the obscure depths of the questing in this game, that only the most resolute players are likely going to visit, that you find the true beauty of the questing and the story of Knights of the Old Republic. Like your main character in the game with the Tusken quest, you have to earn it. And I love it. But even if you don't take a deep dive into the game's depths, there's plenty of reason to come back for more. There are at least 2 completely different paths to complete almost all of the game's quests and story bits, and these ways are not only significantly different from each other, but they can only result in completely different outcomes. So, do you infiltrate the Tusken base, or do you go in all guns blazing and pull an Anakin Skywalker on the Dusty Bastards? Do you favor Salbar's evil brother or his exiled father? Do you blow the Republic's lab, causing a serious setback to your people's research, but also making sure the waters remain unpolluted? Or do you poison the water and let the Republic's facility be while angering the local Selkath authorities? So yes, some of the quests in Knights of the Old Republic are fetch questy, dumb, and poorly written. But when the questing's good in this game, it's amazing. Knights of the Old Republic also features puzzle solving, and there is a lot of it. You got a lot of number puzzles, tile puzzles, and mist-like puzzles. Some of them are mandatory, but thankfully the mandatory ones are either easy or fun or both. But some of them are just alternative ways to get stuff done in the game.
Mind spoilers coming your way.
I absolutely love that if you choose the T3M4 to rescue your companions when they get caught by the Sith fleet, in order to prevent him from getting its memory wiped, you have to do a little math puzzle. But that's not something that's going to happen if you choose some other companion. Some of these math puzzles can be quite challenging, and I'm usually not a fan of puzzles that interrupt the pace of the action in RPGs, especially if they feel like they are there to tick a box. But in Knights of the Old Republic, these challenges feel organic and therefore justified. You do some other stuff in Knights of the Old Republic. From time to time, you have to fend off waves of enemy ships with the Ebon Hawk's cannons, which will probably take you back to the time when Luke was gunning down TIE fighters left and right with the Millennium Falcon's cannons in A New Hope. And there's also soup racing, which was probably meant to give the player the chance to relive the Ben-Hur-esque moment of the soup races in the first movie of the prequel trilogy. I don't think they hit the spot with this one though. In Knights of the Old Republic, you race against time rather than against other races, and that completely kills off any feeling of dangerous high-stake competition. So no, I'm not a fan of the racing in this game, but then again, I usually don't like racing moments in non-racing games, or racing games for that matter. And then there's also Pasak, a card game that's like Blackjack but with a deck of cards, and you can find and purchase cards while you travel about in the world, to make your encounters a little bit easier. The game tries to sell you that this is some deeply tactical card game of which there are tournaments, and that there are even professional Pasak players, people who make a living out of being good with the game. But just play the game a couple of times and you'll see how ridiculous this notion is. Don't get me wrong, I think it's perfect that you have a non-mandatory minigame like this that you can play from time to take a break from your other activities. And at least once, it allowed me to purchase stuff that I needed for a mission because I didn't have enough money. Think of this as a very primitive forefather of Gwent in The Witcher 3. All in all, Knights of the Old Republic is a dream come true. A match made in heaven between Star Wars and everything that's good about RPGs. It does almost everything right in both departments, and it all comes together in a phenomenally entertaining game. Story and lore. Just in case it needs to be said, Disney Star Wars isn't my Star Wars. The way I see it, under Disney's ownership, especially post-2016, Star Wars has been used as a tool to give opportunities to people who didn't deserve them in the first place, and then have the whole communication system that gravitates around Disney celebrate that these opportunities have been given to pat themselves in the back for making the IP more for everyone, or some shit. And that's why it's shit in my opinion. Yeah, these people have no business doing Star Wars movies or shows, and this guy,
Anakin blowing up the Death Star,
this guy should be given a restraining order not to come within 2 miles of any Star Wars production. But like I've said, I also wasn't a big fan of the prequels. There are things Star Wars worth watching aside from the original trilogy, more or less worth watching, but as far as stories go, Knights of the Old Republic and Knights of the Old Republic 2 are amongst the very few things that truly feel like Star Wars, like my Star Wars. Knights of the Old Republic takes place 4,000 years before the events of the first film and right after the Tales of the Jedi comics from the 90s. But lore-wise, if you are a fan of the original trilogy, there's no way this game is not going to bring a smile to your face. You have Twi'leks, Ithorians, Selkaths, Jawas, Rhodians, Wookiees, Miss Alabama and Barbara Butch, you name it. And all of them speak in their languages, just like canon dictates in Star Wars. There's a bit of a cheat here, but let's not get into that. The game also nails locations, vehicles, creatures, and even costumes. And it even puts you in the driver's seat of situations that seek to recreate some of your favorite passages of the films. And on top of that, there's tons of lore about the Sith Academy and its practices and Selkath and Wookiee society. And for those who dig deep enough, there's a lot to sink your teeth into pertaining obscure lore about what Tatooine used to be like before it became a desert planet, the hyper-advanced but long since gone species of the Builders, the Tuskens, etc, etc, etc. So in the lore department, Knights of the Old Republic is an easy 10 out of 10 in my book, except for a little something that we are going to be addressing a little bit later. As for the story, well, it's a nice building with a few poorly decorated apartments. The better story is the one that takes place before the events of the game. Darth Malak, whose original name was Alec, was originally a Jedi Knight who commanded the armies of the Galactic Republic in the Mandalorian Wars. Alec always felt like the Jedi were defaulting on their duty of peacekeeping by being too lenient with the Mandalorian, so he took it upon himself to crush the remnants of the Mandalorian fleet alongside his friend and master Revan and their revanchist band of crusaders. Alec and Revan eventually chased the Mandalorian into the Outer Rim, where they met the Sith Emperor, who easily used their hatred towards the Mandalorian to corrupt them and turn them into Sith Lords. What follows is the story told in Knights of the Old Republic. It's a simple, straightforward story of good versus evil. The Sith have an evil plan, and it's up to you to work with the Republic and the Jedi to thwart it. That's it. That's all there is to it. And for reasons that transpire in the most predictable revelation in the history of video games, you are the key to the Sith Lord's defeat, along with the hot, young Jedi Bastila Shan. The story isn't particularly well written. In fact, it very much starts off with the wrong foot. During the first few minutes of the game, the main character has various short conversations with a random Republic soldier about shit that he absolutely should know, like the name of the ship, the name of the guy who's talking to him, who Bastila is and why she's on the ship, and the reasons that the Sith might have to attack this particular Republic vessel. But as it happens in other BioWare titles, it seems like the game feels the need to let you, the player, in on these things. But instead of letting you piece together what's going on from context, and leaving perhaps a few subtle breadcrumbs for you to do this, they have a character just straight out puke out long-winded explanations blurted out at the worst possible time. Explanations that are also riddled with clumsy, convoluted lines to justify the fact that the character doesn't know shit that he absolutely should know. Like this one here.
I'm Trask Olgo, ensign with the Republic Fleet. I'm your bunkmate here on the Endar Spire. We work opposite shifts. I guess that's why you haven't seen me before.
And this continues well into the first act. Also, there's a big no-no here in the narrative end of things, and it's that it tells more than it shows. So of course, exposition dumps abound, and many times these exposition dumps rob the player of a proper build-up and payoff dynamic. For example, Zalbar joins your party after his friend Mission explains that she wouldn't have been able to free him if she hadn't had your help. But then the Wookiee immediately swears an oath of lifetime fealty to you, and it feels clumsy and rushed, and like something that needs to happen because the plot demands it. And this is just one of hundreds of examples. Bastila Shan is the most important companion in the game, and I find her character particularly terrible. And in order to justify something that happens later on in the game, the narrative goes all in trying to paint her as arrogant, brash, and emotional. But it goes so far down that road that it makes the very notion of her being a Jedi laughable. There's just no way any Jedi Master worth its salt would have granted her the title of Jedi. And again, this is all to justify what happens with her later on in the game, but there was no need to be so blunt and on the nose.
Every time I try to call on all my teachings to calm myself, they fail me.
Your audience is not retarded, you know? And on top of that, sometimes the story needs her to step into the role of the Jedi mentor. And when that happens, she goes full wise bearded dude mode. So yes, her personality swings wildly depending on what the plot needs from her at the time, and I didn't like that one bit. In fact, Bastila's whole personality, rather than feeling like something that naturally makes her prone to that one thing that happens with her near the end of the game, it feels more like BioWare trying to screw the house around the light bulb to make her fit the archetype of the early female BioWare companion. See, in BioWare games, the main character always meets two of its more story-relevant companions early on in the game, and they are always the same. One of them is a guy, and the other one is a chick. One of them, typically the guy companion, is always agreeable and friendly from the start, and the other one, typically the female companion, is disagreeable, arrogant, and it challenges the player to prove her that he deserves her attention. And to this I say, fuck off all characters that fit into this archetype. As far as the structure of the story goes, there are also some convenient events every now and then that come out of nowhere just to push the story forward a little bit, and there is this one location that feels a little bit like filler, and the events that take place in this location take away from the story rather than add to it. Some of these events even water down the impact of revelations that take place later on. It has to be said though, there is a lot of lore-accurate subtext in the story. The Wookiees' zealous adherence to tradition, the neutral law-abiding nature of the Selkath, the sleazy, shady demeanor of the Hutt, the mercantile idiosyncrasy of the Jawas, the Tuskens' aggressive disposition, the history of how Tatooine became what it is now, bits and pieces about the Builders. It's all there, and it's as abundant as any Star Wars fan might wish. When it comes to stories in video games, you have those along the lines of Planescape Torment and Disco Elysium, which are rife with philosophical subtext and food for thought, and then you have those that have no aspiration beyond being solidly entertaining stories, like the ones told in Desperados 3 or Expeditions Rome. Knights of the Old Republic sits solidly in the camp of the latter. It has no pretensions other than to tell a Star Wars story that is fun and exciting all the way through. Also, playing this game in the year 2024 feels like a huge breath of fresh air. It feels comfortable and relatable, like you can put down your guard and not expect to be lectured about this or that. As simple as it is, the story in Knights of the Old Republic promotes universal values that are actually universal. The general notion that people should strive to be the best version of themselves that they can possibly be, the notion that no matter how dire the circumstances, how disadvantageous the situation, or how troubled someone's past has been, a person always has the power to steer the ship of his or her own life for the better. The notion that people who offer you power that you never had before, so that you can put all your limitations behind you, is straight out evil and want to turn you into a puppet for their evil schemes. The notion that if you have wronged someone, you have the obligation to make it up to them. The value of stoicism and the notion that no one owes you anything and that you have to accept that there are bad actors out there that will never change to accommodate you. Also, in a day and age in which space travel was conquered long ago, you see members of every species almost everywhere, but every world is mostly populated by its native people. If this game had been made in the 2020s, you would have gotten one member of each species in every group of counselors, guards, and mercenaries, regardless of the planet's prevalent ethnicity. If this game had been made in the 2020s, the creator would have wasted no time in establishing a direct association between these alien races that have nothing to do with us, and different human ethnicities to then proceed to introduce some subtext about how some of them are good and some of them are bad collectively. Or worse yet, galactic species would have gone out the window in favor of diverse humans so as to make the point even more unequivocal and obvious. In fact, the worst thing about Knights of the Old Republic is the one thing that reminds me of Disney Star Wars the most, and it's the ridiculous, cartoonishly evil representation that you get from every single Sith everywhere. Except perhaps this guy. I know that the Sith are meant to be evil, but evil doesn't mean going out of your way and wasting resources doing shitty things to people when there is nothing to gain. So scenes like this...
These hopefuls will never survive in the Academy. A lesson must be taught here, but I am at a loss as to what form it should take. I'm thinking to spare them the effort of being killed and do it myself. Perhaps I shall turn their skin inside out. Or force lightning. Yes, it's a most impressive display. Or perhaps a bit of humiliation is in order. I could easily strip off their tunics and make them run through the colony. Or they could lose all control of their bodily functions.
And laughs like this undermine the gravitas and verisimilitude of it all just a little bit. The game also likes to throw in things just for the wow factor. But many of these things are just ridiculous. For example, why does Darth Bandit kill these dudes? Man, weren't these guys part of your master's guard? Why did you kill them then? The Sith invested time and effort to train these men and money to equip them. Nah, it was more important to have him do something cool for the wow factor. Also, why do these Sith droids blow up this door? Couldn't they have opened the door, let the droids through, and then closed the door behind them? That would have bought precious seconds for the Sith. Also, there are a few moments here and there in which the game takes a break from being my Star Wars. Like this conversation that you have with one of your fans at the racings in Manan. She says, "Wow, you're like so great. I can't believe you actually spoke to me like wow." And if this is your idea of playing it for the laughs, BioWare, then let me be the one to tell you that it didn't work. In my book, the very best thing about the story in Knights of the Old Republic is that, although there aren't multiple fine-grained endings as there are in Dragon Age Origins, the story forks in two very different paths with very different endings, and it gives a lot of opportunities for you to pave the way to take one route or the other over the course of the game, and this adds tremendous replay value to this title, my type of replay value. And I don't want to end this section without mentioning the way in which Knights of the Old Republic goes on about its humor. BioWare humor is, well, BioWare humor, and it's at its best in games like the original Baldur's Gate and Dragon Age Origins. But Star Wars humor is different.
You made a fair move. Screaming about it can't help you.
Let him have it. It's not wise to upset a Wookiee.
But sir, nobody worries about upsetting a droid.
It's because a droid don't pull people's arms out of their sockets when they lose. Wookiees are known to do that.
I see your point, sir. I suggest a new strategy, R2. Let the Wookiee win.
And Knights of the Old Republic feels like a nice compromise. You have this passage near the end, in which the Elder Rakata tells you that the last time you were there, you came in search of a way to enter the Temple of the Ancients. You claim to be seeking a way to destroy the Star Forge, but you betrayed us. For what reasons have you returned? And one of your dialogue options is, I need to get into the temple so that I can destroy the Star Forge, which I think is a very BioWare humor dialogue option. But then you get stuff like all the funny smell shaming that Wookiees get in the Star Wars universe, and all of the HK-47's hilarious lines, which feel very Star Warsy in my book. Overall, Knights of the Old Republic is a good Star Wars story, and like every good Star Wars story, it's thoroughly entertaining from beginning to end, just don't expect it to be any more than that. Companions, Lorewise. In my book, BioWare was always king when it came to companions in video games, even in their worst video games, at least up until Mass Effect 3. Knights of the Old Republic, though, is not their best game in this respect. Some of your companions are good, some of them are okay, and some of them are annoying and even immersion breaking. In BioWare games, you always have the two sort of standoutish characters that are supposed to be a tad more important than the others, like Alistair and Morrigan in Dragon Age Origins. Well, in Knights of the Old Republic, these characters are Carth and Bastila, and unfortunately, at least to me, these are two of the worst companions. They represent the worst the game has to offer in this department. First, companions are pretty one-dimensional in this game, and the script hammers down mercilessly the one thing they are supposed to be about. Carth, for example, is all about not trusting people because he was betrayed in the past. And that's all there fucking is to him. So he doesn't trust you, and he doesn't want to talk about it. But he also doesn't seem to be capable of changing the fucking topic. Carth is played by Raphael Sbarge, who also plays Kaidan Alenko in the Mass Effect series, and Kaidan is also distrustful about you and your past with Cerberus to the point of being utterly insufferable in Mass Effect 2 and 3. I'm almost beginning to think that this guy has trust issues in real life. Then you have Bastila Shan, which we have already talked about extensively. Some people out there say that Bastila had the exact type of personality that she needed to have so that this other thing could happen near the end of the game. But like I said, it feels more like BioWare screwed the house around the light bulb to make her fill the role of the early story-relevant female sidekick that's disagreeable and arrogant, like Ashley, Morrigan, Miranda, etc. When you first meet Bastila, she arrogantly insists that she's the one who rescued you instead of the other way around. Then she lets a teenager get on her nerves about her power and even makes trivial use of the Force to teach her a lesson, in what feels more like an American Karen move than like something a Jedi would do. I get it, guys, there is a certain something that you need to happen, but don't you think this is too much? At least you have a very Star Wars-y situation with her near the end of the game if you play your cards right with the dialogue options, but even this is stained by some pretty frustrating writing.
Mind the spoilers coming your way.
So, Bastila ends up bending the knee to Darth Malak and giving in to the dark side. And the reason why she's not straight out killed is because she has plot armor. In this case, the plot armor is called Battle Meditation, which is something that she does exceptionally well compared to other Jedi. Fucking really? This unfocused little bastard who is always losing her temper is the one you want to sell me as the Battle Meditation Specialist? Alright. But what probably bothers me the most is that in the succession of dialogue bits that you have during your last confrontation with her, you can only convince her to switch back to the light side by beating her and saying, "You see? The light side is more powerful." So essentially she switches sides again because she thinks she's gonna be on the winning team. What are you, Bastila, a Jedi or a Real Madrid fan? On the good spectrum, you have your droid HK-47, who absolutely steals the show for me. Not only are all of his interventions utterly hilarious and unexpected, but he very much feels like a Star Wars character. And I just love the premise of a protocol translator droid who is always suggesting the violent approach for his own amusement. Also on the good side, if a little bit lower on the ranking, you have the Wookiee Salbar and the Jedi Jolee. Salbar and Mission Vow are a bit of a package deal and they travel together. And there's a half-assedly decent story about how they met and about how they befriended each other. This story is nothing to write home about, but at least it doesn't feel contrived or out of place. We've already said how Salbar's Oath of Life feels rushed and clumsy, and like a good example of how the game drops the ball with build-ups and payoffs. But he has a pretty freaking awesome companion quest, and I admit that all the goofy banter that takes place between Mission and Salbar about brushing his teeth and combing his hair made me laugh every time. And it somewhat reminded me of the banter between Chewbacca and Han Solo. By the way, I think both Chewbacca and Salbar are vastly underrated characters, but that's neither here nor there. Of the Jedi companions, Jolee is probably my favorite. He's a hermit living in the Wookiee world, but there's more to him than meets the eye. He's an old man who likes his old tales, and unlike Bastila, he is very Jedi-like in his demeanor and attitude. If you take him to Manan, he meets an old friend who needs help, and this meeting triggers a quest that ends with a very climactic moment that challenges Jolee's morals and values. And when the shit hits the fan during his friend's trial, he advocates for the right thing to be done, which is in my opinion one of the best written parts of the game. Canderous Ordo is a Mandalorian mercenary who sees you as his ticket out of his situation. He switches sides and joins you because it is convenient for him to do so. And that felt very story and lore consistent. In fact, the story of how he joins you is pretty interesting and organic to the game's main story and events, but he doesn't have much to do or say after that, other than telling you details about the Mandalorian Wars. Juhani is a young Cathar Jedi who had given in to the dark side, who now worries constantly about gaining your trust after what she did. She is in a journey to prove herself, and she has a little to say about her homeworld and her species, but she doesn't bring much more than that to the table. As for Mission Vow, her whole journey is, well, to discover that her brother is not the family first stand-up guy she thinks he is. There is a little bit here about her previous life as a street urchin in Taris, and a little bit there about how she met Salbar, and yet a little bit more to sink your teeth into when Taris is blown to pieces, and when the big revelation of the game comes along. But not enough for me to say that the character is interesting. She's also supposed to be a kid, and she doesn't like it when people call her such. But the notion of her being a kid doesn't sit well with me at all. I don't think they should have made her so hot if they wanted to sell you that she was a kid. Oh well, I did always switch over to her when she was running around here and there. I guess my three main problems with all the characters is that first, they are extremely one-dimensional. Second, most of them are more or less the same person at the end of the game than they were at the beginning. And third, whenever you talk to them, you get only one dialogue option to get them to talk about shit that's relevant to their character. In other BioWare games, some of which came before Knights of the Old Republic, you could talk to your companions about several different topics. It also doesn't help that party banter takes place as cinematic cutscenes that interrupt the action. And it wouldn't be too bad if these cinematic cutscenes didn't serve to further hammer down the one thing the characters are supposed to be about. Overall, these companions aren't bad, but as a whole, they feel like a huge wasted opportunity, and they're definitely not in the same league as companions in other BioWare titles. Companions gameplay-wise. I found my companions to be an excellent party of adventurers who possessed skills and talents that complemented each other perfectly. It has to be said though, every time you meet a companion, you get the chance to level him or her up to the current main character's level from scratch, which means that you are in complete control of their builds. Which is not bad, but I personally prefer when your companions already have some attribute points that you can't reallocate and skills that you can't unlearn when you meet them. It makes them feel like people who've already traveled the world and done some shit before they met you. And it also forces you to play the hand that you have been dealt. But you still have a pretty unique cast of companions. The standouts are the droids in my opinion because they have talents that no other companions have. Your T3M4, for example, is very situational, but if you bring him along for the right missions, he's going to make a world of difference in combat and non-combat situations. And surprisingly enough, this also goes for your Jedi companions for the most part. Yoli is a consular, Juhani is a guardian, and Bastil is a sentinel. So while you can still level them up however you wish, you still have to adhere to each of their Jedi masteries, and that's why they bring different strengths and weaknesses to the party despite the fact that they are all Jedi. I also like that the story sometimes requires you to use specific companions for some specific missions. It's a fun way to give everyone a little piece of the action and to challenge you to find ways to make them work together. And though I usually don't see much replay value in trying different combinations of party members for different missions, or even different builds for different party members, I make an exception with Knights of the Old Republic. This game seems to have been designed with the goal in mind of making you want to play it again and choose the right companions for the right missions, because your companions also have a bunch of non-combat talent. And on top of that, they have situation-specific dialogue bits, and you're surely going to want to hear what all of them have to say everywhere. And last but not least, some companions can craft things for you while they're on the Ebon Hawk. Zalbar can make grenades, the T3M4 can craft computer peaks that allow you to hack terminals, Canderous can make stims, etc. So overall, I think Knights of the Old Republic is one of the very best games that have ever been made in this department. Secondary mechanics and user experience. In addition to all the things that you do in Knights of the Old Republic, you have inventory management, trading, and equipment upgrading. And all of these things are decent as far as the role they play in the game goes. These mechanics are expected, but equipment upgrading in particular adds a gratifying little extra oomph to your gear. When these hard-earned enhancements get finally added to your weapons, and when you see them work in beautiful synergy with your feats, you can hear that little voice inside you saying, hell yeah. And I like that you can swap enhancements around, which really wasn't a thing back in the day. Most of the games that allowed you to socket some shit into weapons and armor would make it a one and done deal. So you would often walk around with unenhanced weapons until you found the very best runes or jewels for the item. As for the user experience, it's dated, guys. There's no way to candy coat it. And you know a game hasn't aged all that well when you don't remember some of the stuff that annoys you now being annoying back in the day. And this game has a few of those things. There's no vis-a-vis comparison of items during trade or at the inventory screen. You need to equip an item and check out how the stats change to know for sure, and some of the stats aren't even reflected anywhere. Also, the equipping screen and the inventory screen are, well, 2 different screens.
Not a great plan.
Which is not only unnecessary, but also unjustifiable, especially since inventory interfaces like the one in Diablo were already a thing by this time. And of course, you don't have many of the quality of life features that you've come to expect nowadays. Filters, tabs, tooltips, the possibility to switch between companions to compare every item that you're about to sell or purchase to what everyone else has equipped, etc. And the same thing goes for feats, powers, and skills. These things would have been much more practical and leaner if they had followed the Fallout or Arcanum approach in terms of the user experience. Everything in one screen, guys, and use all the screen. You have other minor annoyances like unskippable cutscenes, and this one's particularly bad when the cutscene takes place right before a part that can potentially require some save scumming. Pathfinding is also notoriously bad. Your companions do have a tendency to stand in your way, and this is particularly irritating in combat, and very particularly irritating in combat that takes place in narrow corridors. Also, I didn't remember the "you must gather your party before entering forth" moments being so awful. Sometimes you would get this message and wait 4 seconds for your missing companion, only to get frustrated and switch over to him or her to watch the rest of your companions run back, not to where your newly selected character is, but to the part where he or she was at the time she got stuck. This happened only 4 or 5 times, but my god was it annoying. And then there is combat. Combat is still fun, and the game still feels awesome and epic in no small part due to its combat. But man, some of the stuff here user experience wise is really bad. First, there are skills that don't require you to target an enemy or an ally, like the AoE heal or the various force shields and protections that you have. But unless you choose a target, you don't get this little interface, even if you get the skill's animation and the icon indicating that you got the buff. And the problem with this is that when you have a target selected, you can queue in defensive abilities like your shield and auras, but if you don't, it doesn't happen. You have to wait for each animation to end to start a new buff. And this is a royal pain in the ass when you want to buff up all your party members with several different buffs. Also, the game works with a system of action inputs. You can queue in the next 4 actions you want your selected character to take, but it's clunky because sometimes you would clear all your action and start over from scratch, and the game would still input an additional action that you did not choose, and it's not clear why. My guess is that this happens when you clear actions in a moment in which you are in the middle of executing one. Also, your companions have the tendency of just standing there doing nothing, and many times you don't know if it's because of pathfinding issues, or because you didn't input any actions, or because the action simply takes time to execute. In modern games that use real-time with a pause, like the Pathfinder games or Dark Envoy, you have this little countdown to tell you how long the next attack is going to take. But in Knights of the Old Republic, you don't have anything like this, and some of the attacks take significantly longer than others. So I found myself saying, "Anytime now, guys," in every difficult fight. Also, early on in the game, you are taught that cover is a very important thing in this game, but it's an inconsistent game of line of sight, and it's easy to forget how it even works because there isn't a proper cover system. Being able to switch between party mode and solo mode is very convenient and even necessary to get through the toughest fights in the game. The problem with this is that you can only move your characters with your WASD keys or by holding down both mouse buttons. In Dragon Age Origins, having 2 characters walking in different directions simultaneously was paramount to your tactics. But this option is off the table in Knights of the Old Republic because you can only move 1 character at the time. Also, mines have incredible tactical value, but they can also be incredibly frustrating to use in some situations. Here, for example, you can't plant a mine next to a door because the clickable area of the door is just too big. And if there is a mine between your selected character and your enemy, as it happens here, you cannot target the enemy because the clickable area of the mine takes up the entire screen, and it acts like an anti-targeting force field of sorts. All in all, Star Wars Knights of the Old Republic is a product of its time, and in some respects, it hasn't aged all that well. Sound effects and mix.
I will be your doom!
The sound in this game was ridiculously ahead of its time. From the different sounds of the characters' steps upon different surfaces, to the resonance effect that every sound gets while you're in a cave, to the different acoustic that you get in different locations, to the underwater sonic landscape, I couldn't believe how good this was back in the day, and I think it's still pretty freaking good. The mix has some serious issues though, but this is to be expected from a game of the early 2000s. There are volume issues, sound clipping, music tracks that continue over dialogue sequences, and so on and so forth. But compared to other titles from back in the day, it's a freaking masterpiece. And more importantly, it sounds Star Wars-y, as it should. Music. What? What can I say about the music in Knights of the Old Republic, except it's absolutely glorious. When it comes to Star Wars, there are a few tracks that are simply mandatory. You need this to play at the very beginning. You need this transition by the end of the introduction. And you need this for the end credits. Knights of the Old Republic features many of the original tracks composed by John Williams, and the game-specific tracks were composed by Jeremy Soule, no less. So of course they are all on point and epic beyond belief. The music in Knights of the Old Republic is intense during combat sequences, ominous and menacing whenever the Dark Lord appears, and epic whenever it needs to be epic. And if I could give it a 20 out of 10, I would. Voice acting.
Willing to risk open war over this.
It is the Sandrels who have started this, not I.
And here I thought you would blame us if we failed. It seems everyone is responsible for your actions, except for you.
I don't need to stand here and listen to such impertinence.
I'm impressed, Carl. That interjection was very Jedi-like.
What can I say? You pick up a few things.
The fool Ithorian has decided I am to be an expensive purchase. He does this out of greed, and not out of knowledge of my true capabilities. Advisement. I have observed him. He is a coward, and will be responsive to aggressive bargaining.
The voice acting is pretty decent. You have Jennifer Hale, who later went on to play Female Shepard in Mass Effect in the role of Bastila, and Raphael Sbarth as Karth, as well as Catherine Tabor as Mission, who also played several other Star Wars characters in the past, like Padme in LEGO Star Wars and Princess Leia in Star Wars Detours. And you can even catch glimpses of top-tier talents like Simon Templeman and Steve Bloom. But my problem here is with the voice direction. Characters tend to be very one-sided, and the script wants to make sure that you understand the one thing they are supposed to be about. So they hammer that trait or the issue that they want to get across ceaselessly. And unfortunately, this also happens with the voice acting. You do have to give credit to Knights of the Old Republic for the insane number of alien characters you have in the game, and the fact that each of them speaks in his or her own language, and you can even hear the right intonation for the emotion they project. They do cheat a little bit with this, but I'll give it a pass. Overall in this category, you've the great, the good, the meh, the bad, and the ugly all rolled into one. Graphics. The early to mid 2000s was an interesting time. You had immersive detailed worlds like the ones in Baldur's Gate 2, Diablo 2, Fallout, etc. And then you had 3D games which were, in theory, the next generation. But most of these games felt small and lacking in detail compared to those titanic isometric RPGs from the late 90s and early 2000s. But of all those early 3D games from the early 2000s, Knights of the Old Republic, along with Vampire the Masquerade Bloodlines, is one of the better ones. Actually, this game was pretty impressive in this respect, and it still is in my book. Locations are varied, extensive, and lore consistent. Open areas might not be too rich or detailed, but places like the Wookiee village, Tatooine, or Manaan are spot-on representations. As far as creature and character models go, you have a proper cast of lore-consistent NPCs and creatures. Take the Tusken, or the Jawas, or the Banthas that are wandering about in the desert of Tatooine. This game nails all of it. Spaceships in this game predate the ones we see in the original Star Wars trilogy by several millennia, but they still feel like they belong in the Star Wars universe, and the Ebon Hawk is simply amazing. Arms and armor are also on point, and they look pretty cool on your characters. In fact, there's an impressive array of gear that looks unique compared to most other games in the ballpark at the time. And in the animation department, you got everything from Jedi signature moves like deflecting blaster bolts, to elaborate kick animations, to superhero jump, to facial animations. If anything, I think they overdid the eyebrow animation a little bit. You also get a lot of animals and vermin and other creatures running and flying around, like these super cool Briths that fly about in Dantooine. Of course, graphics in Knights of the Old Republic are nowhere near the stuff that we have today in terms of quality, but that isn't really what you should compare them to. This is an immersive Star Wars world, and it's still worth getting lost in, and that's a lot more than can be said of some of the most recent Star Wars shows. Performance and stability. Well, I'm gonna confess I was ready to go down hard on Knights of the Old Republic in this respect. I had all sorts of problems with the game back in the day when I had Windows XP, and then again when I played it a few years later on a Windows 7 machine. And yes, I tried every configuration and compatibility option available. And I still got constant crashes, constant FPS drops. It was a disaster. But this time I played the good old games build and threw in a couple of resolution patches to make the most out of the experience. And surprise, surprise, it was damn near perfect. The game only crashed once, and it was near the end during the waves of Sith. Those who have played the game know that this is the worst possible part for the game to crash. And then there was this time in which mission got stuck outside the Jedi headquarters in Dantooine. And then there is of course the classic hostile Tusken bug that we've had in almost every version of the game, it seems. But other than that, it performs very smoothly. Other considerations and final thoughts. A Star Wars RPG as a concept is too good to be true. Now imagine if it's good. Well, Knights of the Old Republic is just that. A match made in heaven between two of my favorite things. There have been many Star Wars shows, films, and games out there, but very few of them have truly felt like my Star Wars. And many games wear the mantle of RPG these days, but most of them are action games with RPG elements. And many of them don't quite tick the boxes of the things that I consider essential to the RPG experience. But Knights of the Old Republic passes both of these tests with outstanding grades. This is an essential game for RPG enjoyers and Star Wars enjoyers alike. And hey, I would even tell you this, even if you don't care about Star Wars, but if you love D&D 3.5 edition, this is a game that you have to play. It's a top tier gaming experience for the right type of player, and it definitely has a place in the Olympus of games in my book. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up. If you didn't, thank you for watching all the way up until now. If you like what you are seeing on this channel, please consider subscribing and clicking that notification bell to avoid the usual YouTube shenanigans. Come check us out on Discord if you don't mind all the boomer talk that goes on there. I personally love it and wouldn't change it for anything. And share the video if you thought it was cool. Bye, everyone.
You're excused. You can go back to playing video games.